On our anniversary, my husband brought his mistress on stage and shouted into the microphone, "5 years is more than enough. I'm sick of you. You're plain, you're boring, and I want you out of my house tonight." He barked the words, humiliating me in front of his entire extended family and our social circle. He thought I would cry. He thought I would be destroyed. Now, I'll show you who was truly destroyed. That evening, the sprawling backyard of Catherine and Richard's Hamptons estate had been transformed into a fairy tale. Hundreds of fairy lights twinkled among the ivy-draped trees, casting a soft glow over the tranquil surface of the infinity pool. The scent of white lilies and peach roses in every corner blended with the aroma of the gourmet menu prepared by a Michelin-starred chef. The classical melodies of a Juilliard string quartet added an elegant touch to their 5th wedding anniversary. This was a night Catherine had designed with all her heart, a monument of love for their 5-year journey together. Catherine stood near the small stage, her champagne-colored silk gown hugging her figure perfectly. She smiled, greeting every guest warmly. Her eyes, however, never stopped searching for Richard. 5 years ago, they had started from scratch. Richard was just a regular corporate employee with big dreams, and Catherine was a woman who fell in love with his drive and ambition. What Catherine never told him was that she was the sole heiress to the Sterling Empire, a massive corporate conglomerate built by her family. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for her trust fund. So, with her parents' blessing, Catherine lived simply, supporting Richard from the shadows in ways he never noticed. When Richard's startup needed a capital injection, Catherine quietly used a fraction of her inheritance, framing it as a loan from an anonymous angel investor. When Richard needed connections, Catherine arranged coincidental meetings through her father's network at the country club. This multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate, the sports cars in the driveway, the company Richard now proudly led as CEO, all of it was the fruit of Catherine's hidden labor, neatly gift-wrapped as Richard's personal achievements. To her, it didn't matter. Richard's happiness was her happiness. Seeing her husband standing tall and respected by everyone was the greatest gift. Tonight was the pinnacle. All of Richard's business associates, their socialite friends, and their families had gathered together. Catherine spotted her parents at one of the VIP tables, smiling proudly at her. Her father had always been a little suspicious of Richard, believing his son-in-law had risen to the top a little too easily. But her mother always calmed him down, believing Catherine's love had made Richard a better man. Catherine hoped tonight would finally prove to her father that Richard was the right choice. Finally, she saw him. Her husband looked dashing in a bespoke Italian suit, laughing with some key Wall Street investors. Catherine walked over, slipping her arm through his. "The party is incredible, honey," Richard whispered, kissing her forehead. Catherine's smile bloomed. This was exactly what she wanted. But something felt off. Richard's eyes weren't entirely focused on her. Several times, his gaze darted toward the crowd, specifically to a dimly lit corner of the garden. Catherine followed his line of sight and saw a woman she didn't recognize. She was stunning, with long, dark hair and a striking crimson dress that clashed boldly with the soft, elegant tone of the party. She stood alone, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir, her eyes fixed on Richard with an intensity that made Catherine deeply uncomfortable. "Who is she, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, trying to sound casual. Richard flinched slightly. "Oh, that's Madison. She's a new client from a luxury real estate firm." "I invited her to expand our network," he answered quickly. Too quickly, he then pulled Catherine away, diverting her attention to another group of guests. Catherine tried to brush it off, convincing herself it was just silly, fleeting jealousy. An hour passed, and the party was in full swing. Catherine had prepared a surprise. She was going to get on stage, read a love letter she had written, and announce her anniversary gift to Richard. The transfer of majority shares in one of her father's subsidiaries, making Richard the true owner, not just an appointed CEO. The gift was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She couldn't wait to see the joy on his face. When the MC invited the happy couple to the stage, Catherine smoothed her dress. Her heart pounded with anticipation. She held the folded piece of paper with her speech tightly. Richard smiled at her, a smile that now looked distinctly hollow. "You go ahead. I'll be right behind you," Richard whispered. Catherine nodded, slightly confused. She had just taken the first step onto the stage when Richard suddenly pushed past her, walking briskly straight to the microphone. "Hold on a second, darling," Richard said. His voice echoed across the sprawling lawn. The string quartet stopped playing. All eyes turned to him. "There is a much more important announcement tonight." Catherine froze, her hand gripping the stage railing. She noticed Richard wasn't looking at her. He was staring dead ahead at that dimly lit corner of the garden. With measured steps, Richard walked off the stage and through the parted crowd. The guests whispered in confusion. Catherine's parents stood up, looking alarmed. Richard kept walking until he stood face to face with the woman in the red dress. Right in front of everyone, he extended his hand. Madison smiled triumphantly and took it. Richard pulled her close, leading her back to the stage and placing her right beside him under the main spotlight. Catherine was still glued to the steps. The love speech felt like ice in her hand. The world around her slowed down. The joyous smiles of the guests morphed into expressions of shock and utter bewilderment. In the suffocating silence, Richard looked down at Catherine. It was a look she had never seen before. Cold, hateful, entirely devoid of love. The perfect night had just shattered into a million jagged pieces. The silence that blanketed the estate was heavy and deafening. The only sound was the frantic beating of Catherine's own heart, pounding like war drums in her chest. Richard stood on the stage, his arm possessively wrapped around Madison's waist. The woman in the red dress tilted her chin up arrogantly. Her eyes swept over the crowd with a superior glare, before finally locking onto Catherine with a mocking smirk. Catherine stood frozen. The paper containing her vows now felt like a piece of trash. Every beautiful word she had strung together about love, sacrifice, and their future now felt like a bitter joke. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, filled with pity, morbid curiosity, and perhaps a bit of schadenfreude. She was the main attraction in a circus created by her own husband. Richard brought the microphone closer to his mouth. The face that used to smile warmly at her was now twisted into a cruel sneer. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began. His voice was loud, steady, and unapologetic. "I know you all came here to celebrate my 5th anniversary with Catherine." He paused, letting the tension mount. Then, he looked down at his wife with sheer contempt. "But tonight, I want to end this whole charade. 5 years is enough. I've spent 5 years trapped in this suffocating, boring marriage." A collective gasp rippled through the affluent crowd. Catherine's father, a man known for his stoic composure in boardrooms, shot up from his chair, his face crimson with rage, fists clenched. Her mother grabbed his arm, tears welling in her eyes. They wanted to rush the stage, but Catherine caught their gaze. She shot them a look so unnervingly calm that it commanded them to stay put. Richard continued, his voice dripping with venom, making sure every word cut as deep as possible. "I'm sick of you, Catherine. You're plain. Look at you. You don't even try to take care of yourself. Your entire personality is painfully dull. You thought you could buy my happiness just because you come from money? You were wrong." Every insult felt like a physical blow. Plain. Boring. Catherine had always dressed modestly to ensure Richard never felt overshadowed. She intentionally hid her wealth so he could shine. The sacrifices she made out of love were now being weaponized as repulsive flaws. And then came the final strike. Richard raised his voice, pointing a finger directly at her. "And worst of all, you're barren. 5 years together, and you couldn't even give me a child. What good is a wife if she can't even do the one thing she's supposed to do?" The crowd fell dead silent. Catherine's breath hitched. That was their deepest secret. The medical records clearly stated the fertility issues were Richard's, not hers. But to protect his fragile ego, she had promised to carry the burden, letting his family think it was her fault. And this was her reward. Madison let out a soft, tinkling laugh next to him, a sound like a death knell for Catherine's marriage. She whispered something in Richard's ear, making him grin wider. "So, Catherine," Richard said with finality, "the party is over for you. Go pack your bags and get out of my house tonight. I never want to see your face here again." My house. The words hung in the air. The estate bought entirely with Catherine's trust fund, the deed that clearly bore the name Catherine Sterling, her maiden name. Richard was so deep in his delusion that he had forgotten the most basic legal facts of his own existence. In the breathless silence following the storm of his words, everyone waited for Catherine's reaction. They waited for the hysterical sobbing. They waited for her to collapse in shame. They expected the melodramatic breakdown of a woman destroyed on her happiest day. Richard and Madison waited with smug smiles, certain they had completely broken her. But what they expected never happened. No tears fell from Catherine's eyes. No sob escaped her lips. Instead, after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, Catherine did the unimaginable. Her lips slowly curled upward, forming a smile. It wasn't a sad smile or a forced one. It was a calm, elegant, icy smile that made the hair on the back of Richard's neck stand up. It was dangerous. With graceful movements, as if nothing had happened, Catherine slowly crushed her love speech into a small paper ball and dropped it onto the manicured grass. She smoothed her silk gown, lifted her chin high, and began to walk, not away to hide in tears, but straight toward the stage. Every step was measured and precise. The clicking of her designer heels against the stone steps was the only sound in the yard, ticking like a countdown to Richard's doom. The crowd instinctively parted for her, looking at her with a mix of awe and terror. Richard and Madison watched her approach, confused. The triumphant grins faded, replaced by wary expressions. They expected a shattered victim, not a queen marching to reclaim her throne. Catherine reached the stage. She didn't walk up the stairs. She simply stood at the bottom, looking directly up at Richard. Her eyes, usually full of warmth, now glinted like steel forged in fire. "Are you quite finished?" Catherine asked. Her voice was crystal clear, perfectly stable, without a single tremor. Richard was momentarily stunned by her composure. "What do you want?" "Get the hell out of here," he snapped, trying to regain control. Catherine smiled wider. "It's not my time to leave just yet. It's my turn." With a movement so swift Richard didn't even process it, Catherine reached up. Before he could react, her slender fingers closed around the microphone. There was a brief tug of war, but her grip was ironclad. The microphone was hers. She didn't step onto the stage. She stayed on the ground level with the guests, silently communicating that she was one of them, not a participant in the cheap melodrama above her. She turned the microphone on. The heavy silence was ready to be shattered. On stage, Richard and Madison stared at her with a creeping sense of dread. They had just woken a sleeping lioness, and they had no idea how to stop her. The microphone felt cold and solid in her hand. Its weight grounded her. She took a deep breath, not out of nervousness, but to gather all the strength she had kept tightly bottled up for the past 12 months. "Thank you, Richard," she began, her voice echoing smoothly across the lawn. "Thank you for that incredibly theatrical announcement. I have to admit, you've always had a flair for the dramatic." A few nervous chuckles escaped from the crowd. They didn't know how to react. Richard frowned, completely thrown off. He wanted her begging, broken, not delivering calculated sarcasm. Catherine turned her gaze away from him, sweeping over the crowd like the perfect hostess. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unpleasant interruption. This was supposed to be a beautiful evening, but don't worry." She offered a small, sharp smile. "Consider this the opening act. The entertainment for my Independence Day." Whispers broke out. Independence Day? The concept was so bold no one could fully grasp it yet. Catherine locked eyes with Richard again. The smile vanished, replaced by a piercing, deadpan stare. "Richard, you were right about exactly one thing. 5 years is enough." Richard looked momentarily relieved, thinking she was finally conceding. Madison smirked. "More than enough," Catherine emphasized. 5 years is entirely too long for me to fund the life of a parasite like you." The word parasite dropped like a bomb. Richard's face went from pale to ghostly white. His jaw clenched tight. "What the hell are you talking about?" He hissed loudly enough for the mic to pick up. "What am I talking about?" Catherine let out a humorless laugh. She began to pace slowly in front of the stage, like a star prosecutor presenting her opening statement. "Let's break it down. 5 years ago, you were a junior analyst drowning in student debt. Then, suddenly, you had the capital to launch your own firm. You told everyone it was your life savings. Remarkable coincidence, wasn't it?" She paused, ensuring every guest was hanging on her every word. "Then, your company miraculously landed that massive government contract. You needed a high-level connection, and somehow, you bumped into the exact right senator at a charity golf tournament. You called it luck. An even more remarkable coincidence. Then you needed a house to match your new status, and we found this multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate for a fraction of its market value. You told everyone you were a master negotiator. The most incredible coincidence of all." She stopped pacing and stared him down. All those coincidences. All that luck, it all has a name. Richard. And her name is Catherine. My money. My family's connections. Everything you flaunt as your hard work was a handout from me. Richard was trembling with a mix of fury and profound embarrassment. You're lying. That's slander, he shouted. Catherine ignored him. Her gaze shifted to Madison, whose triumphant smirk was entirely gone. The woman in the red dress was looking frantically between Richard and Catherine. And as for you, sweetheart, Catherine looked Madison up and down with utter disdain. Whatever your name is, congratulations. You've just won a man. She paused, letting Madison hold on to a shred of hope. A man who is about to become homeless. Madison's face drained of color. The illusion of her glamorous future was cracking. Don't listen to her, babe, she's just jealous, Richard yelled, trying to convince Madison and perhaps himself. Jealous? Catherine raised an eyebrow. Oh, Richard, that feeling died a long time ago. All I feel now is pure disgust. She turned her full attention back to Richard. The crescendo had arrived. Earlier, you so confidently kicked me out of your house. That was the funniest part of this whole circus. Catherine took a step closer to the stage. Richard, darling, your memory seems to be failing you. Perhaps you've been too busy managing your mistress. Let me refresh it. 5 years ago, before we got married, my attorneys handed you a stack of paperwork. You were so desperate to marry the quiet, unassuming girl who happened to have a small inheritance that you signed it all without even hiring your own counsel. Do you remember? Cold sweat broke out on Richard's forehead. The prenuptial agreement. He had treated it like a mere formality. In that document, Catherine's voice rang out like a judge delivering a sentence. It clearly states that all assets I owned prior to the marriage and all assets purchased during the marriage using my private funds remain entirely mine. No alimony, no 50/50 split. Catherine smiled at the sheer horror dawning on his face. And guess what? This magnificent estate, she gestured around her, was bought entirely in cash from my private trust a month after our wedding. The deed is sitting in my safe, under my maiden name, Catherine Sterling. Those luxury sports cars in the garage? Birthday gifts from me to myself? That vintage Rolex collection you love to flash around? Gifts from me to you. Which, legally, I can and will repossess. Utter silence. Not even the crickets seemed to chirp. And most importantly, Catherine saved her final lethal blow, the company you run so proudly. Vanguard Solutions. You thought you built it from the ground up, Richard? Vanguard is a shell subsidiary of Sterling Enterprises, my family's company. I placed you there as CEO just to give your fragile ego something to brag about. Your title, your salary, your corporate card, it all comes from me. She lifted the mic, her eyes blazing with absolute victory. So allow me to correct your earlier statement. This is not your house. This is my house. You don't get to kick me out. Her voice dropped to a freezing register. I am kicking you out. And oh, one more thing. As the actual majority shareholder, consider this your official notice. Richard, you're fired. Richard's entire reality collapsed in real time. Madison physically stepped away from him, looking at him as if he carried a contagious disease. Every ounce of pride, status, and wealth Richard thought he owned vanished in the blink of an eye, obliterated by the calm words of the woman he had just tried to destroy. The shockwave from Catherine's declaration was silent but devastating. Time seemed to stand still. Richard stood petrified, his mouth slightly open, his eyes hollow. All the color had drained from his face, leaving a pale mask of absolute horror and disbelief. Beside him, Madison looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her arrogant smirk had evaporated, replaced by pure panic as she realized her golden ticket was a sinking ship. The guests, who had been whispering, now began murmuring openly. Their voices were a mix of shock, admiration for Catherine, and blatant mockery aimed at the couple on stage. Those who had looked at Catherine with pity moments before now looked at her with newfound reverence. She wasn't a scorned wife. She was a queen who had just ruthlessly reclaimed her throne. In the midst of the chaos, Catherine's father finally moved. His red, angry face had transformed into an expression of fierce, overwhelming pride. He finally understood. The daughter he always thought was too soft and naive had a spine made of titanium. He caught Catherine's eye. A single, subtle nod from her was the only order he needed. Her father pulled out his phone and gave a quick signal to a group of large men in sharp black suits who had been blending in as guests. They were the Sterling family's elite private security detail. Their objective was now clear. With swift military precision, 4 guards converged on the stage, surrounding Richard and Madison. "What the hell is this? Don't touch me!" Richard finally snapped out of his paralysis, trying to project a dying shred of authority. "This is my party. I'm the host. Get out!" But his words held zero weight. The lead security officer, his face completely deadpan, said, "Mr. Davis, Miss, Sterling has requested that you and your guest vacate the premises immediately. I'm not leaving. This is my house." Richard babbled, his voice cracking with desperation. It was useless. 2 guards gripped his arms with vice-like strength. He struggled, but they easily overpowered him. Madison shrieked as the other 2 approached her. "Let go of me! I have nothing to do with this!" she screamed, trying to pull away. In front of hundreds of elite guests, the couple that had stood so haughtily on stage minutes prior was now being dragged away like common criminals. Richard's bespoke suit was violently wrinkled. His hair was a mess. Madison's glamorous red dress looked pathetic as she stumbled across the manicured lawn. The humiliation was absolute. Not a single guest stepped in to help. They just watched coldly, and several even had their iPhones out, recording the spectacle. While the execution took place, Catherine remained perfectly still. She pulled out her phone and opened a group chat she had prepped months in advance. The group was titled Operation Independence. It contained her lead attorney Eleanor Wright, her private wealth manager, and the head of IT at Vanguard Solutions. She typed a single word: execute. Miles away in Manhattan, professionals who were intentionally working late sprang into action. At the private bank, a single keystroke froze every joint account and credit card bearing Richard's name. His mobile banking access was revoked. In less than 30 seconds, Richard was completely financially paralyzed. At the corporate data center, an IT admin executed a script. Richard's corporate email was disabled. His access to company servers, client databases, and digital keycards was permanently wiped. Virtually, he was erased from his own company. At the law firm, an associate hit send on a drafted email. A formal termination letter was sent to Richard's personal inbox, CCing the entire board of directors. It was silent, fast, and lethal. A perfectly executed corporate assassination. Back in the garden, Richard and Madison's screaming faded away until the heavy iron gates slammed shut behind them. The atmosphere settled, but this wasn't awkward silence, it was an electric buzz of adrenaline and awe. Catherine raised the microphone one last time. She looked incredibly relaxed. The massive weight she had carried for the past year was finally gone. "Once again, I apologize for the overdramatic intermission," she said with a genuine, glowing smile. "Now, let's leave the trash where it belongs." She picked up a fresh glass of Dom Perignon from a passing waiter's tray. "This party is far from over. Tonight, we aren't celebrating a fake past. We are celebrating a new beginning, to the future, and to freedom." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. The tension shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of genuine celebration. The quartet struck up a lively, upbeat tune. Guests swarmed Catherine not to comfort her, but to congratulate her. They praised her brilliance and her ruthlessness. She was no longer a victim, she was a legend. Outside the formidable iron gates, the scene was a stark contrast. The sky opened up, and a sudden, torrential New York downpour began. Richard and Madison stood on the side of the dark, winding Hampton's Road without an umbrella, without a destination. Shivering, Richard pulled out his phone and frantically opened his banking app. Access denied. He tried to order an Uber Black using his corporate card. Card declined. True. Paralyzing panic gripped his chest. He opened his personal email and saw the subject line that made his knees buckle. Notice of immediate termination. He collapsed onto the wet curb. His expensive Italian suit was soaked and smeared with mud. Everything was gone. The house, the job, the money, the status, wiped out in 15 minutes. Madison stared down at him. The look of adoration was replaced by venomous hatred. Her gorgeous dress clung uncomfortably to her, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She didn't see a rich, powerful CEO anymore. She saw a soaked, pathetic loser. "So," Madison said, her voice sharp as glass over the sound of the rain, "where exactly are we staying tonight?" Richard just looked at her with empty, terrified eyes. He had no answer. He had absolutely nothing. The universe's karma had just clocked in for its shift. Exactly 1 year prior, at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, Catherine was jolted awake by the buzzing of a phone on the nightstand. It wasn't hers. Richard had forgotten to silence his. Normally, she wouldn't have cared, but the buzzing was relentless, indicating a rapid-fire string of text messages. Annoyed, Catherine reached over to turn it off so Richard could sleep. But as the screen lit up, a preview notification from an unsaved number caught her eye. "Babe, booked the plaza for the weekend. Don't forget your excuse for the wife. Can't wait." Catherine's world stopped spinning. The air in her lungs turned to ice. Babe, the plaza, the wife. Those words hit her like a sledgehammer, cracking the foundation of the trust she had painstakingly built over 4 years of marriage. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Richard, snoring softly beside her, was entirely oblivious to the hurricane currently ripping through his wife's soul. Her first instinct was primal. Wake him up, smash the phone into his face, and scream for an explanation. She wanted to break every lamp in the room. But then, a cold, calculating logic washed over her, suppressing the raging inferno of her emotions. What would a confrontation achieve? Richard would lie. He would invent a story about a prank, a wrong number, a crazy client. He would beg, cry, and swear loyalty. And Catherine, blinded by love, might have forgiven him. Then Richard would just learn to hide his tracks better, continuing to play her for a fool. No. Catherine Sterling refused to be the fool. The agonizing pain slowly hardened into something else. Something cold and metallic. A resolution. If Richard wanted to play with fire, Catherine would make sure he burned to ashes. But not tonight. She would wait. She would plan. The next morning, Catherine acted as if nothing had happened. She made his pour-over coffee, fixed his tie, and kissed him goodbye at the door. But behind her warm smile, her eyes recorded every detail with predatory sharpness. The way he avoided her gaze. The way he kept his phone face down. The micro-lies she used to ignore were suddenly illuminated by a glaring spotlight. The mask of perfection had slipped, and Catherine could see the rot underneath. Her first move was contacting a high-end private investigator recommended by her father's head of security, a stoic, hyper-professional ex-FBI agent. Catherine gave him one piece of intel. The burner number. "I want everything," she told him, in a quiet, steady voice in a discreet Manhattan coffee shop. Who she is. Where they meet. How often. And most importantly, follow the money. The first dossier arrived a week later. The woman was Madison Montgomery, an Instagram model trying to pivot into luxury real estate. The photographs the PI provided were excruciating to look at. Richard and Madison dining at Le Bernardin, shopping at the Dior boutique on Fifth Avenue, even taking a weekend trip to Street Bart's. Catherine's heart fractured again, but she didn't let a single tear fall. She converted the pain into fuel. The most damning report was the financial one. The PI had tracked the spending. The Michelin star dinners, the Hermes bags, the Rolex for Madison, the rent for her upscale Chelsea apartment. It was all being funneled through Richard's corporate expense accounts. Richard was embezzling company funds, her family's company funds, to finance his mistress. This wasn't just infidelity anymore. It was a felony. It was exactly the ammunition she needed. Catherine moved in the shadows. She met with her family's most ruthless attorney, Eleanor Wright, a brilliant, shark-like senior partner. Together, they drafted a flawless declaration of war. Phase 1. Secure the assets. Catherine began quietly moving millions from their joint accounts into private offshore trusts, citing a massive, time-sensitive real estate venture to Richard. Blinded by the prospect of massive returns, Richard eagerly signed every authorization document she put in front of him without reading the fine print. Simultaneously, Catherine revoked every power of attorney he held, severing his legal access to her wealth. Phase 2. The paper trail. In her capacity as majority shareholder, Catherine ordered an aggressive internal audit at Vanguard Solutions under the guise of prepping the company for an IPO. The auditors were secretly instructed to drill down into the executive expense accounts. As expected, they uncovered massive fraud. The evidence was meticulously cataloged, ready to be detonated at a moment's notice. For 365 days, Catherine lived a double life. To Richard, she remained the doting, slightly naive wife who worshipped his success. She smiled when he lied about working late at the office. She packed his suitcase when he claimed he had a business conference in Miami, knowing full well he was taking Madison. Every lie he told, every fake smile he gave, Catherine swallowed whole, storing it as ammunition. It was the longest, most grueling year of her life. She had to suppress the urge to vomit when he touched her, and choke back her rage when he praised her for being the perfect wife. Her patience wasn't weakness. It was the sharpening of a blade. Then, the opportunity presented itself. The 5-year anniversary. Richard himself suggested throwing a massive gala at the Hamptons estate to show off their wealth. Catherine instantly agreed. It was the perfect stage. A massive arena with a captive audience where she could shove Richard off the highest pedestal into the deepest abyss. She even leaked details of the party to one of Madison's friends, hinting that Richard was planning a huge surprise, ensuring the mistress would crash the party to witness her supposed victory. Catherine knew Richard's arrogance and Madison's greed perfectly. She handed them the rope, knowing they would eagerly tie their own nooses. A week before the party, Catherine met Eleanor in her Madison Avenue corner office. The files were stacked perfectly. The forensic audit, the wire transfers, the photos, the termination papers, the asset freeze injunctions. "Are you absolutely certain, Catherine? This is going to be a bloodbath," Eleanor said, looking at her young client with a mix of concern and deep respect. Catherine stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. Her face was tranquil. Her eyes were glacial. "He didn't just betray my marriage, Eleanor. He insulted my intelligence, stepped on my sacrifices, and stole from my family. A bloodbath is exactly what he deserves." She turned back to the lawyer. "Have it all ready for Saturday night. I want him left with absolutely nothing. Not even the shirt on his back if my money paid for it." The first night after the exile was absolute hell. The torrential rain acted as a silent witness to Richard and Madison's rapid descent. After failing to access any money or call an Uber, they were forced to walk miles along the dark shoulder of the highway, desperately seeking shelter. Richard's custom suit and Madison's couture dress were soaked, caked with mud, clinging to them like a pathetic second skin. The luxury that defined them hours ago had washed away into the gutter. With a few crumpled $20 bills Richard happened to have in his wallet, they managed to rent a room at a rundown neon-lit motel off the I-95. The stench of mildew and stale cigarette smoke hit them like a wall the moment they opened the door. The bedspread was a faded, questionable brown, the wallpaper was peeling, and a flickering fluorescent bulb hummed aggressively overhead. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the penthouses and 5-star resorts they were accustomed to. Madison screamed hysterically when a massive roach darted across the bathroom tiles. "I am not sleeping here. This is disgusting," she shrieked, her voice hoarse from crying and screaming at the rain. "Then where the hell do you suggest we go?" Richard snapped, his temper finally exploding. The stress and humiliation had completely vaporized his suave persona, leaving behind a frantic, cornered rat. "This is your fault. If you hadn't insisted on doing it in front of everyone—" "My fault? You were the one whispering in my ear to humiliate her. You said the stupid bitch wouldn't do anything. It turns out you're the stupid one, Richard. You didn't even know she owned everything." Madison spat, pointing a manicured, mud-stained finger at his chest. A vicious screaming match ensued. They blamed each other, traded vile insults, and tore down whatever affection they claimed to have. The love and passion that fueled their affair evaporated in that dingy room, replaced by toxic regret. They were trapped in a cage with their own colossal failure. By the next morning, their destruction became public entertainment. A prominent NYC socialite who attended the party had uploaded her crystal-clear recording of the stage confrontation. The 5-minute video hit TikTok and Twitter with the caption, "Number Instant Karma Cheating CEO Gets Destroyed by Billionaire Wife at Anniversary Party." Within hours, it was a viral phenomenon. Richard's sneer, Madison's smug face, and their subsequent pathetic, muddy ejection were broadcast to millions. Memes flooded the internet. Number Queen Catherine and number Richard the Parasite trended #1 worldwide. They couldn't hide. Desperate, Richard tried calling his Wall Street buddies, the men who used to drink his scotch and laugh at his jokes. He hit a brick wall. Most sent him straight to voicemail. Others made weak excuses and hung up. Finally, a guy Richard considered his closest friend answered, his tone ice cold. "Lose my number, Richard. I'm not tanking my firm's reputation by associating with radioactive waste. You picked a fight with the Sterling family. You're dead in this town." The line went dead. Richard finally understood. The respect, the handshakes, the VIP access, none of it was for him. It was for Catherine's money. Without her, he was a nobody. Madison faced her own reckoning. Her modeling agency dropped her instantly due to the PR nightmare. Her socialite friends blocked her on Instagram. The luxury boutiques she frequented blacklisted her. The viral label of a gold-digging homewrecker permanently closed every door she had fought to pry open. After a few days surviving on cheap takeout with their dwindling cash, reality hit hard. They needed liquid assets to survive. Reluctantly, Madison decided to pawn some of her investments, the luxury bags and jewelry Richard had gifted her. They walked into a high-end luxury consignment store in Soho. Madison, trying to project whatever dignity she had left, placed her prized orange Hermes Birkin bag on the glass counter. It was the ultimate status symbol, a gift Richard gave her after he supposedly closed a massive deal. The appraiser, an older man with thick glasses, examined the bag under a loupe. He checked the stitching, the leather stamp, the hardware. After a tense 5 minutes, he pushed the bag back across the counter. "I'm sorry, miss. This is a counterfeit. It's a very high-tier super fake, but it's completely worthless here," he said flatly. Madison's world crumbled for a second time. "That's impossible. My boyfriend bought this directly from the boutique for $30,000. She shrieked. The appraiser raised an eyebrow. "Then you should have the receipt and authentication papers, yes?" Madison whipped her head toward Richard, her eyes murderous. Richard looked at the floor, his face pale and sweating. I got it from a private broker," he mumbled, refusing to meet her gaze. The hideous truth spilled out in the middle of the boutique. Richard had never bought her the real thing. He couldn't afford it without triggering red flags on the audit, so he used company cards to buy high-end knockoffs to keep her happy. Cards that were now canceled, leaving him holding the massive debt. Madison stared at him, no longer with anger, but with profound, bottomless disgust. The man she thought would give her the world was nothing but a cheap fraud. The luxury she had sacrificed her reputation for was a literal lie. "You broke, pathetic liar," Madison hissed. She snatched the fake bag and stormed out of the store, leaving Richard standing there, crushed beneath the weight of his own lies. In that moment, among the fake luxury goods, Madison realized their relationship was exactly like the bag. An imitation of something valuable, but ultimately worthless. While Richard and Madison drowned in the swamp they had created, Catherine was redesigning her world with the precision of a master architect. The Monday morning after the party, she didn't take time off to mourn her marriage. Instead, she put on a razor-sharp navy Tom Ford power suit, pulled her hair into a sleek chignon, and walked through the glass doors of the Vanguard Solutions skyscraper in Manhattan. She didn't enter as a guest, she entered as the conqueror. An emergency board meeting had been convened. The room was full of older, seasoned executives, veterans who had worked for her father for decades. They knew Catherine as the quiet heiress, the supportive wife of their brilliant young CEO. When Catherine took the head chair, the doubt in the room was palpable. They respected her name, but they thought this was the emotional reaction of a scorned woman playing corporate dress-up. Catherine let the silence stretch, locking eyes with every board member, radiating an icy calm that unsettled them. She didn't ask for pity or mention her personal life. "Good morning." Her clear voice cut the tension. "As you are all aware, the CEO seat at Vanguard is currently vacant. I am here to inform you that I am assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." A senior director, a man named Robert, cleared his throat. "Miss Sterling, with all due respect, we deeply sympathize with your situation. But running a billion-dollar subsidiary requires experience. Perhaps we should bring in an interim CEO while you take time to heal?" Catherine offered a razor-thin smile. This was exactly what she wanted. Thank you for your concern, Robert, but I believe I've had plenty of rest over the past 5 years, allowing an incompetent man to run this firm using my brain. The statement stunned the room. Catherine pressed a button on the remote, and the massive screen behind her hummed to life. But it wasn't standard financials. It was blueprints, corporate strategy maps, and highly detailed acquisition proposals. Proposals that everyone in the room recognized. The Liberty Project, that boosted our margins by 200% 2 years ago? Catherine pointed to the screen. That was my thesis. I handed it to Richard when he complained about stagnant Q3 numbers. The hostile takeover of Apex Dynamics? That was my 3-month market analysis, which I had to summarize into a 2-page brief because Richard couldn't understand the complex financials. For the next 20 minutes, Catherine dismantled every single achievement Richard had claimed, providing undeniable proof, time-stamped emails, original drafting documents, even sketches on cocktail napkins. She wasn't just the money behind Vanguard, she was the architect. The skeptical old guard sat in stunned silence, their mouths slightly agape. They weren't dealing with a spoiled princess. They were dealing with the actual apex predator they thought Richard was. I stayed in the shadows to protect my husband's fragile ego, Catherine concluded, shutting off the screen. I no longer have that handicap. So, if anyone here doubts my competence, my assistant has your severance packages ready. But for those who want to work with me, we are taking Vanguard to a level Richard couldn't even dream of. No one spoke a word of dissent. The sheer gravity of her intellect and power obliterated any remaining doubt. Within 3 months, Catherine revolutionized the company. She gutted the bloated bureaucracy, promoted brilliant young analysts Richard had suppressed, and made aggressive moves that initially terrified the board but paid off massively. She worked 18-hour days, fueled by limitless energy. Her entire aura transformed from a soft, retiring wife to a terrifyingly effective titan of industry. The climax of her takeover came when she personally secured a multi-billion-dollar federal grant for a national renewable energy infrastructure project. It was a contract Richard had repeatedly bungled. Catherine, with her flawless presentation and aggressive lobbying, decimated the competition. The ink on the contract made headline news across Wall Street. Catherine Sterling became the new icon of female corporate power, a symbol of absolute resilience. That evening, after the press release, Catherine stood alone in her corner office, overlooking the glowing grid of Manhattan. She felt accomplished, but a quiet emptiness lingered. The victory was sweet, but the battle had been emotionally exhausting. Her assistant knocked and walked in carrying a massive, breathtaking arrangement of flawless white roses. Catherine frowned. She hadn't ordered them, and PR knew she hated generic congratulatory gifts. "Who sent these?" she asked. "There's no name, Miss Sterling. Just this card," the assistant said, placing the vase on the mahogany desk before slipping out. Catherine leaned in. The scent was intoxicating. She pulled the small ivory envelope from the stems. Inside, written in sharp, elegant handwriting, was a single sentence. "I always knew you were the genius in the room." D. Catherine stared at the card. D. It was just an initial, but suddenly, the ice around her heart cracked, letting in a sliver of genuine warmth. In the midst of her absolute power, a sweet mystery had just knocked on her door. 6 months after the party, Richard's world had shrunk to a moldy, cramped studio apartment above a noisy bodega in a sketchy part of Queens. The walls were peeling, the radiator clanked aggressively, and the smell of stale beer and exhaust fumes was his permanent reality. His penthouse life felt like a fever dream belonging to a dead man. Madison had abandoned him 3 months prior. There was no dramatic fight. He just woke up one morning to find her gone, taking the few items they could still sell. She left a note on a napkin. "I can't do this. Good luck." Richard didn't even feel heartbroken, just numb. To afford cheap ramen and rent, Richard took any under-the-table job he could find. He hauled bricks at a construction site in the freezing rain until his back gave out. He mopped floors as a janitor in a downtown shopping mall, keeping his head down, terrified someone would recognize the viral cheating CEO. The hands that used to sign million-dollar deals were now calloused, blistered, and permanently stained with bleach. At night, lying on his lumpy mattress, regret ate him alive. At first, he mourned his money, the cars, the respect. But as the brutal reality of poverty stripped away his arrogance, he was forced to look inward. He began to remember Catherine. Not Catherine, the billionaire CEO who destroyed him, but Catherine, his wife. He remembered how she used to have a hot bath waiting for him when he was stressed. He remembered how she rubbed his shoulders and listened to him complain about the company, her company, for hours. He remembered her genuine, radiant smile when he brought her cheap bodega flowers, a smile he never once saw on Madison's face. He realized the true magnitude of his loss. He hadn't just lost a fortune. He had thrown away the only human being on earth who had truly, selflessly loved him. That realization was a torture far worse than the poverty. Catherine's face was on the cover. She looked magnificent, sharp, confident, and incredibly powerful. The headline read, "Catherine Sterling, the woman building America's future." Richard stared at the glossy cover for a long time. It sparked a desperate, insane idea. He had to see her. He had to apologize. Not to get his money back, he knew that was impossible, but to beg for forgiveness, hoping to alleviate the crushing guilt suffocating him. Using his meager savings, he bought a cheap button-down from a Goodwill and tried to make himself look presentable. He took the subway to the financial district, walking up to the towering glass monolith of Vanguard Solutions. Standing in the gleaming lobby he used to command, Richard felt like an insect. Men in Brioni suits rushed past him, talking about mergers. He didn't belong here anymore. He took a breath, preparing to beg the receptionist to call upstairs. But before he could move, the VIP elevator chimed. The brass doors slid open, and Catherine stepped out. Time stopped for Richard. She looked 1,000 times more beautiful in person than in the magazine. She wore a stunning ivory trench coat, and she was laughing a bright, unburdened laugh he hadn't heard in years. And she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a tall, strikingly handsome man radiating quiet authority and old money. He looked at Catherine with total adoration, and Catherine returned his gaze with a spark in her eye. Richard froze. He knew exactly who that was. Daniel Vance. D. He was an old childhood friend of Catherine's, a venture capitalist who was essentially her equal in status and intellect. They looked flawless together, a true power couple. They walked right past Richard, barely 10 feet away. But to them, he didn't exist. He was just part of the lobby architecture, a scruffy, invisible man standing by a pillar. Seeing her so vibrantly happy, completely untouched by the wreckage he had caused, delivered the final, fatal blow to Richard's soul. His pathetic hope for forgiveness shattered. Catherine hadn't just moved on. She had built an empire of happiness over the ashes of what he destroyed. There was no space for him in her universe, not even as a regret. Shoulders slumped. Richard turned around and walked out of the revolving doors, back into his dark, miserable reality, knowing he was condemned to rot in it forever. After fleeing the Queen's studio, Madison found herself drowning. The internet never forgets, and her reputation as the viral homewrecker was a permanent scarlet letter. No agency would touch her. No broker would hire her. And every rich man she tried to hustle recognized her from TikTok and laughed in her face. Living in a squalid, roach-infested SRO in Newark, the harsh reality broke her sanity. Her warped mind decided that all her suffering was Catherine's fault. If Catherine had just been a weak, submissive wife, Madison would still be rich. Driven by desperate malice, Madison bought a burner phone and began texting Catherine. It started with vile insults, then escalated into extortion. Madison threatened to go to the tabloids and invent horrific lies about Vanguard Solutions, claiming they used sweatshops, or that Catherine's father was involved in organized crime. Finally, she demanded a $2 million wire transfer, giving Catherine 24 hours before she destroyed her. Catherine read the texts in her office. She didn't blink. She simply took screenshots and forwarded them to Eleanor Wright. Catherine's legal team didn't even bother negotiating. They acted like apex predators. They hired investigators to dig into Madison Montgomery's past, and what they found was a goldmine of filth. Madison wasn't just a gold digger, she was a career grifter. She had a history of running romance scams on wealthy, lonely men in 3 different states, draining their accounts or trapping them in fake crypto investments. Most victims had been too embarrassed to press charges. Eleanor took the extortion threats and the mountain of evidence of past wire fraud directly to the FBI and the NYPD. The next afternoon, Madison sat in her dingy Newark room, chewing her nails, waiting for a multi-million-dollar wire transfer to hit her phone. Instead, the cheap wooden door was nearly kicked off its hinges. NYPD! Open the door! Madison's heart stopped. She opened the door with trembling hands, only to be yanked into the hallway by 2 detectives. Madison Montgomery, "You are under arrest for extortion, wire fraud, and grand larceny," the detective barked, slamming her against the wall and clicking cold steel handcuffs around her wrists as her neighbors recorded the scene on their phones. Once again, her downfall was caught on camera. Karma had collected its final debt. A year passed since the catastrophic anniversary party. The Hamptons estate was once again glowing with fairy lights and fresh flowers. But the energy was entirely different. There was no tension, no fake corporate posturing. It was warm, genuine, and filled with laughter. Catherine stood on the same stage. But she wasn't alone. Standing proudly by her side, holding her hand, was Daniel Vance. Their relationship had blossomed organically. From mutual respect, deep friendship, and a shared drive. Daniel never tried to overshadow her. He elevated her. Tonight, Catherine wasn't celebrating a corporate merger. She was launching the Beacon of Hope Foundation, a massive nonprofit she fully funded, dedicated to providing legal, financial, and psychological support for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. Catherine took the microphone, her sapphire blue gown sparkling in the spotlight. She looked out at her parents, her friends, and the survivors who were the first beneficiaries of her foundation. "A year ago, standing on this exact stage, I learned a brutal lesson," Catherine began, her voice rich with emotion. "I learned that sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you is the violent push you need to find your best self. True strength isn't about never falling down. It's about how fiercely you rise from the ashes." She never mentioned Richard's name. The past had zero power over her. Tonight, we aren't celebrating revenge. We are celebrating light. Every person here has a fire inside them. This foundation is here to help reignite the flames of women whose light was stolen by the cruelty of others. Because the greatest victory in life isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's building a beautiful, unstoppable life without them. The applause was deafening. Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with pride. Catherine had taken the deadliest poison of her life and synthesized it into the cure for others. Miles away, deep in the grimy bowels of the NYC subway system, a man in a neon orange MTA janitorial vest was scraping dried gum off the concrete platform. He looked haggard, a decade older than his actual age, his eyes dull and lifeless. It was Richard. Suddenly, a massive digital billboard across the tracks lit up. Catherine's gentle, smiling face filled the dark tunnel. Beneath her was the slogan for the Beacon of Hope Foundation. "You are not alone. Let's rise together." Richard stopped scraping. He stared up at the glowing screen, looking at the woman who was once his world. There was no anger left in him. Just an agonizing, hollow abyss of regret that physically ached in his chest. He looked at her brilliance, her kindness, her unimaginable success. And he felt the full, crushing weight of what he had thrown in the garbage. This was his hell. Not the manual labor or the poverty, but the eternal, inescapable awareness of the paradise he had burned down with his own hands. 3 years later, the salty ocean breeze played with Catherine's hair as she sat on the terrace of a stunning cliffside villa in Malibu, overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The sun was melting into the horizon, painting the sky in violent, beautiful strokes of violet, orange, and gold. The crashing waves were a natural symphony, miles away from the chaos of Manhattan. It was her first real unplugged vacation in 3 years. Daniel walked out onto the terrace, placing 2 mugs of artisan tea on the teak table. He sat beside her, not speaking, just sharing the magnificent view. The silence between them was never heavy. It was a comfortable, secure, quiet, forged over years of true partnership. "Trying not to think about the European expansion proposals?" Daniel teased gently, bumping his shoulder against hers. Catherine let out a light, airy laugh. "For the next 5 minutes, no," she replied. "I'm practicing the fine art of doing absolutely nothing. It's harder than it looks." "That's because your brain operates at 1,000 miles an hour," Daniel smiled. "But you've earned this, Kate. You outworked Wall Street." Catherine rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. 3 years had passed, and the echoes of her previous life were completely gone. Her corporate rise was legendary, but her true victory was internal. During her marriage to Richard, she had shrunk herself, dimming her own light to keep a fragile man comfortable. Now, she owned her brilliance without apology. She had reclaimed her identity. She never actively looked for updates on Richard or Madison. They were a closed book, tossed into a fire. But the universe had a dark sense of humor. A few months ago, driving back to New York from a ski trip with Daniel, they had stopped at a grimy interstate rest stop on the I-95 to get coffee. As Catherine walked toward the entrance, she saw a man in faded coveralls emptying the trash cans by the gas pumps. He was gaunt, weathered, and beaten down by life. It was Richard. There was no cinematic gasp. No rush of adrenaline or vindictive joy. Catherine just stopped for a fraction of a second. She watched the man who broke her heart, the man who tried to publicly execute her dignity, wrestling with a leaky garbage bag in the freezing cold. Richard hadn't seen her. His eyes were glued to the dirty concrete, his world reduced to trash and survival. Daniel, noticing she had stopped, followed her gaze. "Kate," he asked softly. Catherine took a breath, turned to Daniel, and smiled genuinely. "I'm fine," she said. And she meant it. "Let's go get that coffee." In the car, Daniel held her hand. "You okay?" Catherine looked out at the highway stretching ahead of them. "Years ago, I thought I'd feel triumphant seeing him like that. I thought I'd revel in the karma," she confessed. "But looking at him, I felt absolutely nothing. He's just a stranger. A stranger who has nothing to do with my story anymore." That was the moment Catherine knew she had truly won. Victory wasn't watching Richard suffer. His suffering was between him and God. Her victory was looking at her darkest trauma and feeling nothing but total, unshakable peace. Meanwhile, inside the concrete walls of a federal women's penitentiary, Madison stared blankly at the metal bars of her cell. Stripped of her designer clothes and makeup, she was just inmate 8,472, serving an 8-year sentence. Her beauty was fading, replaced by a permanent scowl. Karma for her wasn't just losing money, it was losing her ability to manipulate the world. She was trapped in a cage, entirely forgotten. Back on the Malibu terrace, the sun finally dipped below the water, leaving a canvas of twilight. Catherine opened her eyes and looked at Daniel, the man who loved her, not because he wanted to hide in her shadow, but because he wanted to fly alongside her. "Thank you," Catherine whispered. "For what?" Daniel asked softly. "For helping me remember what it feels like to be me." Daniel smiled and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. They didn't need any more words. Sitting on the edge of the continent, wrapped in the fading light, Catherine Sterling had found the ultimate triumph. It wasn't a victory, marked by applause or destroyed enemies. It was the quiet, eternal victory of peace. Her story didn't end with revenge. It ended with a new beginning, where she was the undisputed author of her own destiny.